think we can start now, or it's 2 minutes after the hour. So I'll start with a prayer, and we can let Matt get on with all the history. Gracious Father, please be with us today. Please open our eyes and ears to the history of the early Christians so we can find parallels in their lives with ours and examples of their faith that we can carry forward. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to meet long distance. Please be with those of us that we can't, that we always meet long distance. Please let them know they are in our thoughts and prayers, and we miss them very much. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Thank you, Jim, and welcome. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for coming to this second of 3 classes on the early church. I'm looking around, I see a lot of names are familiar from last week, but if you weren't here last week, know that there was a recording done of the first session, and it's up on YouTube now. If you go to the church's site, you can find that if you want to get caught up. From those of you who were here last week, you know that I make heavy use of PowerPoint, and so we are going to be doing a little screen share of that in just a few moments. And I'll try to do a quick overview of where we were, where we're going today, and then what we'll be looking into next week. Hopefully this screen share comes through pretty clearly on your screens. Give me a thumbs up if that's coming through. Excellent. All right. So last week, we really tried to focus on essentially the first 3-4 decades of the early church. If you use the year 30 as a date of Jesus' death, and then subsequently, I might go ahead and do a mute all just because we're getting a weird echo from some folks. I'm not sure. It's not personal, I promise. So if you get muted, we're just trying to make sure that we can. Although it looks like I don't have the ability to control that, so never mind. Maybe Jim does this. In any case, so those first 3 decades are really what we focused on from the day of Pentecost, really into getting into questions about not only just Paul, but the wider disciples spreading out in the mission to the Gentiles across the Mediterranean. And we spent a bit of time talking about the Council of Jerusalem right around the year 49 or 50. That was an incredibly important moment in determining or helping to determine the relationship between Judaism and Christianity and the degree to which new Gentile converts whether or not they had to adhere to Jewish practices like circumcision, kosher, things along those lines. And out of the Council of Jerusalem came really a sort of charge and mandate to Paul and to others that Gentile converts did not need to observe these traditional Jewish practices in order to be Christian. Instead, it was their belief and faith in Jesus as Messiah and Lord. That was the distinguishing characteristic that made someone a Christian rather than their particular practices. So it was around that time we ended up talking at the very, very tail end of our session, and this is where we'll pick up today, about how in the 60s, you began to have this interesting situation going on where the center of early Christianity was within Jerusalem. There's a reason the Council of Jerusalem took place in that Jerusalem church. That was where Peter, where James the Just, John, a lot of the other apostles and major figures were there in the church in Jerusalem. And that was really where the center of decision-making happens. But you have this curious case as you start getting into the couple decades beyond that, in which the Gentile population ends up being one of the fastest growing populations within early Christianity. All right, my infant son is pounding on the glass over there, sorry. So you have during the 60s, you have this time period where there is suddenly this major shift going on within important leadership at that time. You have the death of Paul around the year 64. You have Peter, who is crucified in Rome, possibly around that same time, although the exact timing around Peter's death is a little unclear at times. And then you also have James the Just, who was the leader of that Jerusalem church, who died. There are 2 possible dates given, either during what is the siege on Jerusalem or potentially even earlier in the decade. But all of these three probably would have been the most prominent leaders within the early church. All of them pass away within the 60s. And it is during that time period that we are going to get into our first topic today, which is the fall of Jerusalem. So during this time, there is a massive revolt within Jerusalem and surrounding area against Rome, something that takes place over a period of several years that eventually culminates in the absolute devastation and destruction of Jerusalem around the year 70. And so we're going to dig into that a little bit, not only just for the importance for how the church developed, but really it also helps to set the stage too for some of the ministry that Jesus is doing and kind of the undercurrents that were there during Jesus's time. So in order to go forward, I'm going to go back a little bit just to give you a sense of why tensions were so high within Judaism against the Roman Empire. So this is going back now a couple centuries, but from the year 140 to 63 BCE, the kingdom of Judah was actually independent. This is coming on the wake of a few centuries of Greek occupation, and there was a revolt against Antiochus IV, a Greek ruler at that time. There was a revolution against him, the Maccabean revolt, that ended up winning Jewish national independence for the first time in centuries. And so this was really an important moment for not only just Jerusalem, but the people of Judah at that time. However, that 63 date was right about the time that the Romans really began to flex their muscles and expand across the Mediterranean. And Judah got swept up in part of this power grab. Once they were conquered, there was sort of this, over subsequent decades, a slide into Roman occupation. So about in the year 37, Judah was renamed Judea by the Romans. They became what's known as a vassal state, which means they were kind of half in, half out. They weren't really allowed self-rule. Herod the Great was appointed leader and answered to Rome while also somewhat governing independently. But this continued to track further. By about the time that Jesus was born, the kingdom was divided into three separate kingdoms after Herod's death. You have Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, these separate regions. And then finally in the year 6, Judea becomes a separate Roman province. Now this was sort of a making official of something that had been going on for decades, but the status as a Roman province meant some level of peace and protection from Rome. But it also meant that they were clearly occupied. They had to pay heavy taxes to Rome, and eventually there began to be this really strong undercurrent of wanting to rebel again. There were sort of these memories of this period of Jewish national independence from several generations prior, and there was this desire to be able to be independent once again. There was a series of famines and some financial troubles within the Roman Empire that had absolutely nothing to do with Judaism or Jerusalem. But the overall effect of this was that the Romans began to tax even more heavily in the 40s. So this would be shortly after Jesus' death. And because of this, there were a few really prominent and militaristic national independence groups that formed. The Zealots, that name may be familiar to you. One of Jesus's disciples is referred to as Simon the Zealot, and there are questions about his connection. It's ultimately unknown, but Simon the Zealot may have been connected to this group and may have seen Jesus once upon a time as sort of this military figure and leader that could help overthrow Rome. You also have the Sicarii, literally daggermen, who were sort of somewhere between assassins and terrorists. They would knife Romans or Roman sympathizers in the streets. And there was really this strong sense of trouble going on in Jerusalem in this time. Eventually, things hit a point where in the year 66, things went into outright revolt. There continued to be numerous attacks on citizens. It's a little unclear in the history, but believed to be a lot of assassinations by the Sicarii. And the Roman governor that was present within Jerusalem took money and other things from the temple and arrested several of the most prominent Jewish leaders. The response to this was a real amplification. Eventually, the governor and the Romans were run out of Jerusalem, and the sort of puppet king, Herod Agrippa, was also forced to leave as well. And so in the wake of this, there was a sort of temporary rebel government formed, and then began a lot of infighting. As I wrote, there was a coup of the coup within a span of several months. Things really just devolved rapidly during this time period. It was at that time that Rome caught wind of all this, that their leader was run out of town. And so one of their major generals, Vespasian, was tasked with bringing Judea back into the fold. If you know anything about the Romans, they generally were not kind when it came to taking back control. And Vespasian really executed a strategy of trying to starve people, so to speak. Essentially, the idea was to not waste Roman army by trying to attack a fortified city and instead starve people out. And unfortunately, over the course of several years, the Jewish resistance movement really depleted heavily over that time period. In 69, Vespasian was named emperor, and his son took over that siege. And his son, I don't know if he wanted to prove himself or what, but decided that now is the time to attack. He waited, unfortunately, until the time of Passover, which meant that there were a lot of Jewish pilgrims entering into Jerusalem at that time. So there were massive amounts of civilians, and it really was just a very chaotic time in the city. And over the course of several months, the Roman army laid siege to Jerusalem, ultimately leading to the destruction of the temple you see there. This is from a wall, kind of a monument talking about the ransacking of the temple and destruction of the temple. And so in the aftermath of that, Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, claims that 1 million people died in this siege, although that is presumably a high number, but even still, it was an absolutely devastating thing for not just obviously Jerusalem, but for the Jewish people. The temple, which was really a symbol coming out of the Babylonian exile of sort of this new beginning. The second temple was destroyed utterly, and Jerusalem ceased really to be a major center of the early Christian movement after this point. From what we can tell, whether James the Just was leading them at this time or whether it was a subsequent leader, the Jerusalem church fled to a city, the Pella, but unfortunately, there's really not a whole lot written about them or what may have gone on in Pella at this time. They almost seem to have sort of faded from historical record. This may have been a very small remnant of the Jerusalem church. The Jerusalem church leadership may have actually largely passed away in the siege of Jerusalem. But the overall effect was that what had once been the center of Christianity for decades was destroyed. And so now you had this situation in which you have a largely Gentile-driven and growing movement where the center all of a sudden was damaged. And at this point, it really became a question of what was this next generation of Christians? What was it that was going to hold them together? What was it that connected the church in Corinth to the church in Rome, to the church in Antioch? And it's into that kind of vacuum that we see important writings, and specifically the New Testament writings, begin to be developed and to begin to kind of take hold in these different regions. So you have Jerusalem's fall. I listed this map, and I'll have it up for just a second. These were not the only places that Christianity was present. I want to be clear about that. But these 8 sites would have been some of the most major and prominent. Particularly the Church of Antioch was a very, if you remember from last week, that was where Paul's missionary journeys went out from. It was kind of an important seat. It's probably second only to Jerusalem within the early church. But it's during this time period that we begin to see, sorry, I forgot about this slide. I apologize. The other thing that I think is really important to note is that unlike James the Just, who had this really prominent position of authority in the Jerusalem church, as far as scholarship can tell, there was no similar figure after James the Just's death. There was no pope, as we know. There was a bishop of Rome, but that bishop did not have the authority that the Pope has, or that we would ascribe to. And so there really was this sense of a vacuum in which these writings began to take prominence. So before I turn to the development of the New Testament canon, does anyone have any quick questions? You can either enter it in the chat, or you can just ask it out loud. I'm happy to respond. All right. Well, hearing none, we'll keep going. But please feel free, if you do have any questions, to type it into the chat as we go. Oh, I thought I heard someone.
Yes, I'm always curious what kept the church together, or you know, why it did prosper when there were other sects developing at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'm just always like to find more information about that.
Yeah, well, that's hopefully we'll, fingers crossed, be accomplishing that at least a little bit, because I really do think that you can draw a pretty clear parallel between the sort of destruction of the Jerusalem church and the just sudden explosion of writings within the early church, whether it's the Gospel of Mark being written almost contemporary with the destruction, to Matthew and Luke and other writings really taking place in that time. So yeah, we'll try to draw a few lines there between how that's connected to how the church kind of stuck together through this transition period. So in terms of the content of the New Testament, one of the things that I often talk in classes about, and say it just because it's hard for us to wrap our minds around, is that oral tradition really was at the center of how the early church grew. Many people, perhaps even most people, didn't have the ability to read, and so it was oral storytelling and passing on verbally that was the way that the church grew. Whether that was Paul or others going into cities to preach, whether that was even just instruction within house churches, it was rare that someone had the ability to both write and read in a community, or maybe there would only be one or two people. And so that sense of oral tradition was really what drove the church's growth in its early years. However, given what we know about the way that things kind of rapidly went from, you have these kind of early pillars of the church, to use Paul's terms, you have them within the span of a decade, from the start of 60 to 70, this incredible kind of drop off and dying of apostles, early church leaders. I really do think that you can draw a really close parallel between that and this recording of these traditions. So from what we can tell, and I think there's really no reason to doubt this, given that Luke essentially spells this out at the start of his gospel, a lot of what the gospels are doing are taking pre-existing tradition, whether it was oral or written, and I believe Luke uses the word try to provide an orderly account. What they are doing is essentially reconstructing Jesus' life and ministry within their gospel that they're writing. And what they're doing then is they are relying on sources, whether those sources are verbal, whether those sources are written. And it was from all of these different sources and authors like Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, collecting these sources and compiling them, that we begin to get the sort of formation of the New Testament as we know it today. And I'm going to pull up a slide here that kind of gives you a little sense of the complicated ways that these all fit together. But what I really want you to take away from this is just a sense of how some of these Gospels really are reliant on one another, or at minimum have shared traditions. Now you see Mark, this kind of purple part, the triple tradition. It is widely assumed that both Luke and Matthew were aware of Mark, given how much of Mark appears within them. You see almost 3/4 of the Gospel of Mark appear within the Gospels of Luke and Matthew. Luke and Matthew also, I'll see if I can annotate and circle this, they have this shared tradition, what has been known in scholarship circles as Q, for quelle. It's this idea of a shared tradition that both Luke and Matthew had that Mark was otherwise unfamiliar with. Largely, these were sayings, and sayings attributed to Jesus. And the fact that both Gospels would have them while Mark didn't, we would assume that Mark just didn't have access to this source, presumably written, although perhaps verbal as well. And then each gospel also has material that is unique to it. I mean, in Luke, you see, Luke is actually, has a significant portion of the gospel, over 1/3 is completely unique to Luke, including some of our most beloved parables, things like the parable of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the prodigal son. These would have been things that Luke either read or heard from other sources in compiling his gospel. That Matthew and Mark just weren't aware of. And I think knowing this and knowing that these Gospels were being written within different locations throughout the Mediterranean, throughout the Roman Empire, I think can help us understand with why there is coherence at times, and I don't want to say discoherence because there's not, just there are access to different sources and parables and all these other things that make up the Gospels. That is largely a reason why, is that they're, in the case of Luke and Matthew in particular, being written roughly simultaneously, just in different contexts. So I've always found that to be really fascinating, and fascinating as well when we get into a little bit more about what was kind of behind the Gospel writers, what we would call emphases, or what they were really trying to communicate with their Gospels. So within the Gospel, right, sorry. I do instead want to go to do a little bit of dating first, just to give you a sense of how this did develop. So Paul's letters are believed by and large to have been written between about a decade, from 51 to 62, shortly up until the time that he passed away. You have the Gospels being written down, Mark likely during this fall of Jerusalem or siege of Jerusalem time, Matthew and Luke and kind of those couple of decades after. And then the Gospel of John, written towards the very end of the first century. And John, obviously, if you've ever read it in close comparison to Mark, Matthew, or Luke, known that the Gospel really does have a great deal of difference to it. Again, that's not to say that it's really just relying on different sources and different witnesses. And I think that is an interesting piece to account for. And then the rest of the New Testament, I just kind of grouped as early church writings. The dates on these vary wildly. Some may even be before 80, and it's just difficult to ascertain that. But most are, again, towards the tail end of that first century time. So in terms of the content about what's going on within these and why they came to be kind of prized and valued within the early church, Paul's letters, it's not hard to see why they were so appealing within. Paul's letters appear on almost every single list as we start getting into the development of the canon. Paul's letters appear on almost every single one of them. And part of the reason is that he is addressing and talking about very real church issues that churches are going through, particularly these house churches that are more or less functioning in isolation from house churches in other areas. What Paul is doing by offering these letters, and what we would kind of know as circular letters, meaning they were meant to be distributed among many house churches within a region, is that he was trying to help provide some sort of sense of connection and unity and shared understanding that could exist throughout all of these places. And there is a pretty good level of evidence that collections of Paul's letters began even by the end of the first century to begin circulating among churches throughout all these various regions, that these letters were really seen as important and prominent within early Christianity. even obviously during Paul's time for these specific communities, but really shortly after that, just because a letter was written to the church in Corinth doesn't mean that Philippi or Ephesus couldn't use that letter as well. And so this sort of package of Paul's letters came to be incredibly important. There are debates around which letters Paul wrote when you look at the New Testament. The ones listed here are sort of undisputably Paul, or at least undisputable in the eyes of scholars. There are ones where there's some level of debate, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, and Ephesians, largely centering around differences in eschatology, which is a concept of the end time and how second coming would be. Those all seem to have a different sense of what that would look like compared to the undisputed letters of Paul. But in any case, there is enough similarity or possibility that they may have been written by Paul. There's some that scholars are pretty unanimous in saying were not written by Paul. And then you also have others that are just unfortunately lost to time. They appear in lists. You see I don't mean the book of or the letter of Ephesians that we know. This would be an additional letter to the Ephesians. There were an additional 2 epistles to the Corinthians. There is a letter to, I think it's Laodiceans, that appears on some early church canon lists, but that, as far as we know, we have no copies of what the material was of that, but it was at least seen as authoritative within some communities. You have all these lists of letters of Paul that begin to be collected and shared among churches. One of the other points of curiosity is why letters appear in the order that they do within the biblical text. And as far as scholars can tell, it just has to do with the length that the books were written in rather than anything else, which is a little confusing.
Matt?
Yes, yeah, sorry, I know I'm talking.
There's a question in the chat if you wanted to look at it.
Oh, sure, yeah. So Marcia, since we know that Luke also wrote Acts, was Acts written during the same time frame as the Gospel of Luke? Great question, Marcia, and yes, almost certainly it was written. They may have even been shared together. I mean, the intros to both books are essentially, it basically lays out this is part 1 and part 2, and there's enough connecting them that I would assume that at minimum there is like, or I shouldn't say at minimum, at maximum there is a year or 2 difference, but it really is more or less seen as one book by scholars. It's a great question. All right. So I'm just going to do a quick run through. I want to be mindful of time because I know that everyone's obviously aware of a lot of this, and I do want to get to the history beyond it. But I think it's important just to kind of establish what these early texts were and why they were important. So the Gospel of Mark, as I said, is believed to have been written in the early stages of I see Lucy has a question. So before I jump into Mark. Yes, Lucy.
I have a question, and I'm not doing my video today because I haven't taken a shower. So anyway, but
sounds like a statement.
yeah, it's a statement. That statement, but I do have a question. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were they scholars? How did they have the education to be writing these Gospels?
Yeah, I mean, there is enough that is not known about the specific authors that ultimately it just remains up in the air. I mean, it's obviously safe to assume that they knew how to read and write to be able to compile all of these different sources into one cohesive whole. There is clearly some level of editing for consistency and coherence that has taken place as well. I mean, you see within shared material from Matthew and Luke, the way that they group it is different. And so there's clearly, I don't know if you could say that they're scholars, but at minimum they had good training in both writing and knew how to construct things like that. It may not even be a stretch to say that they had some level of scholarship. So yeah, I guess that would be my quick response. In terms of their connection to the disciples, I mean, it's an open question about whether this was the Matthew that was named among Jesus's disciples. Same with, it may have been. We know that if you take Matthew as a tax collector, presumably would have had some familiarity with the written word. It's also not to say other people, even if they start out as fishermen or physician, people have the ability to learn these skills over the course of their life. And so, I mean, presumably could have written later. But
Okay.
yeah, I guess that's my rambling answer to your question. Does
Well,
that
and
help?
it also makes me wonder just one more little piece of it, whether, I mean, it was not them sitting down at the breakfast table writing, you know, their memoir kind of thing, their remembrance of Jesus, but it really probably was, as you say, a compilation as well.
Yeah, I mean, almost certainly these were a compilation of sources. And like I said, the Gospel of Luke almost specifies that at the start of talking about making an orderly account and essentially listening to witnesses. One of the really interesting things, Marcia, you brought up the connection between Luke and Acts. There's a series of passages in Acts that use the first person, which it kind of jumps off the page at you, and that the vast majority of the book of Acts is written in sort of this omniscient third person narration. And then there's just these random pivots to first person narration. Most scholars assume that this was just a travel diary or a source that Luke was using to construct the events of that time, and that this first person account was one that he had used. For whatever reason, didn't change the tense, but yeah. Received another question, did the gospel writers know each other, and did they know Paul? A fascinating question that I would say ultimately is unknowable. I would assume that the early church was small enough that writers like Matthew, Luke, Mark, they may have known one another, or at the very least were familiar with one another's writings. It may be, you know, it may be like how Luther and Calvin never met one another, but were familiar with each other's via correspondence. I mean, it's hard to say. And then there is also a question of, did they know Paul? Again, given how small that the early church was, I would say they almost certainly knew of one another. Whether or not they had direct acquaintance, I think, is a question. But I would assume that many of the authors, at minimum, knew of one another. But that might be overstating it. I don't know. Unfortunately, it's an answerable question. All right. If there are any other questions, please feel free. But otherwise, I'm going to churn really fast through the Gospels and what each Gospel is trying to do. So the Gospel of Mark is, as we said, very influential in that material from it really appears in the other Gospels. Many believe that Mark was writing to a Gentile audience based on the bizarre thing that he occasionally explains what Jewish customs are, which if he was writing to a Jewish audience, there really would be no reason to do so. But really, one of the main focus points in Mark is explaining why Jesus died as a Messiah and explaining why that was an intentional and indeed even what needed to happen. And it's believed that this would have been writing against, we talked about this a little bit last week, a more commonly understood idea that a Messiah would be a sort of political military figure, and sort of getting back to this era of Jewish independence. Mark is really interested in reshaping what messiahship means, and to say it was not a political or military messiahship. It was Jesus who died on the cross to save us from our sins, to repair the relationship with God, essentially. And that was Mark's, the sort of suffering servant depiction of what a Messiah would be. Within the Gospel of Matthew, the kind of counterpoint to Mark is that Matthew, if you've ever read through the Gospel, quotes Jewish scripture all the time, or what we know as the Old Testament, is very interested in showing the ways in which Jesus was fulfilling scripture. You even see, if you read the second chapter of Matthew, you know, as we come up on Advent, and kind of the ways in which there's some strange similarities between Moses's early life and Jesus's early life. You have both Pharaoh and King Herod ordering the death of babies under the year of 2. You have Joseph having a dream in which he ends up in Egypt to avoid this, and then ends up going from Egypt back to Israel, sort of this like experience of the Exodus. There are these connection points. There is the sort of Sermon on the Mount and this connection between Jesus and mountains that's similar to Moses and Sinai. There are all these ways in which Jesus is sort of being positioned as a greater Moses and expanding on Moses. And the connection that I think we would say is that Jesus, rather than Moses bringing the law, the Torah, Jesus is the new law. And that's this sort of depiction that Matthew is making, and sort of this argument that Matthew is making to a largely Jewish audience. You have in the Gospel of Luke, Luke was very focused on Gentiles and on Jesus' ministry being for all people. You catch that at a lot of points throughout the Gospel. We already talked about those parables being different from some of the others, but Luke was also extremely concerned with how the poor and the oppressed were treated. And you think about in the early church, what's believed is that many early Christians were in oppressed classes and oppressed groups. And it seems clear that Luke has this focus on material poverty is a point of real interest and emphasis. You think about in the book of Acts, these descriptions of the early church, believers sharing what they had and being able to support one another. That seems to have been a really important focus for Luke in terms of how the early church would function. And finally, we talked about how John is different from others, that it has what we would describe as a highly developed Christology, which really is just a understanding or ability to articulate who Jesus is. If you read the first chapter of John, you know right from jump, this is a different depiction of who Jesus is. Or I shouldn't say different. It is a much clearer depiction of who Jesus is. You don't have Jesus making extended speeches by and large within the Gospel of Mark. In John, the final discourse to the disciples, it's five chapters of Jesus speaking and teaching to the disciples. So what we assume is that John had a lot of sources. There are specific sources like the signs and the miracles text that really are otherwise unattested in the other Gospels, but that have connection. The signs and miracles, think about the water into wine at Cana. These sorts of accounts that just don't appear in the other Gospels. And the Gospel of John is also much more consistent about references to Jesus' divinity, including Jesus himself claiming divinity in a way that the other Gospels are a little more cagey about. So those are the Gospel texts. I think I'm actually going to skip through this slide, although I'll give you just a quick, just so you could see. These are the other early church writings that appear within the New Testament text. But rather than get into content, I really want to fast forward just a little bit into talking through how we came to have all these Gospels, early church writings, Paul's letters, how we moved from that to a definitive canon, but also to understand what was the structure that allowed us to make this definitive canon of material. So in order to do that, we are going to turn to a early church document called the Didache, which is probably one of the more, it actually almost was included within the New Testament canon when the time came to narrow things down. But it appears to be a late first century document dealing with early Christian practice, as well as sort of laying out what the early church's leadership and organization would look like, ways the sacrament would be practiced, et cetera. It's an incredibly important thing. It, for a long time, was believed to be lost until a copy of it was found in 1873, and it's been an incredible gift to scholars trying to reconstruct the early church. It is widely believed at this point. There was some belief that it was a later document, But as far as scholars can tell, it may have been written contemporary with the Gospel of Matthew and within that community, based on the way that it quotes scripture from Matthew, but it's sometimes is differing to some degree. It may suggest that there's sort of a contemporary construction going on here. But the reason why this is interesting is this gives us an incredible window into what, as we kind of move from the first to the second century, what the early church would have looked like, or practices that were becoming to be shared among these different communities. It speaks about baptism being done by immersion in the name of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that triune formula that we still use today is spelled out very clearly in the Didache, and it's again connected to Matthew. You have that Great Commission, baptizing in the name of Father, Son, and Spirit. So there's that connection there. It lists out the ways in which communion would be practiced, as well as specific prayers that would be lifted up in communion. And other practices like saying the Lord's Prayer 3 times per day is a really interesting piece that was encouragement within the early church, as well as 3 different fast days on a given week. But one of the other pieces that's really interesting about the Didache is that it also starts to really get into questions about church hierarchy and the ways in which it reflects this sort of what seems to be a changing of the guard almost between the early church and what would become a more episcopal or bishop-driven structure. And so the way that the early church seems to have been organized, that churches would have been formed when Paul or another apostle came. They would establish this community with converts, and that after they left, as we see with Paul, they would write letters or would have correspondence, but there would be leaders within these house churches who were somewhat informal leaders, so to speak, but they were also oftentimes commissioned by Paul or other apostles for roles. The 2 roles, or really 3 roles, but 2 prominent roles early on were the role of deacon, which we obviously have reclaimed within the Presbyterian Church today. You see this even as early as Paul's letter to the Romans, that deacon is a spiritual leadership, but also one of service, that caring and charitable work within one's church family and church community was seen as the role that people would be ordained into as deacons. And you also have presbyters, where we draw our name from, with elders in the Presbyterian Church. You see this role continue to be developed, even though it's referred to earlier than that. You see this role really be talked about in later New Testament writings, or writings that have been dated to that time period. And that these elders were the ones charged with governing the church. During this time period, though, you also start to see bishops taking on a good deal of prominence. I have here listed that bishops were also known as overseers. There seems to have been this shift that took place over several generations, in which it became less about groups of elders making decisions, and instead would be bishops of a group of house churches within a region that would make decisions on behalf of that. And so really what we see is this shift from sort of this equitable elder governance within individual house churches to a wider system in which bishops would oversee several house churches within an area. And so there's this shift that's taking place as we go from the late 1st century into the early 2nd century. And so you see here, I have this kind of, it's fascinating that we go from this kind of itinerant apostle model to a much more orderly sort of ordaining of bishops and that structure. So the other things that help us kind of understand a little bit more about this time period are a handful of very, very early church father writers. Clement of Rome, who is known as Pope Clement, even though it doesn't have the same meaning that we come to think of the Pope today. Clement was writing from the very end of the 1st century, and in it he really lays out this system of how presbyters and bishops would relate to one another in terms of governance. And And he also writes about how the apostles appointed bishops and deacons, as sort of making this connection between the sort of apostolic age with this episcopal age that they were moving into. Ignatius of Antioch is where we really, and unfortunately, one of the pieces of Ignatius is that the timing of his writings and his life is a bit unclear historically. He is, in various sources, he's recorded as either being held as a child by Jesus or dying in the year 140, which a little math will tell you it would be pretty difficult to hold those two things. But the timing of him is really, really important because Ignatius is really strenuously saying or arguing for bishop rule. And the fact that he is even making that argument means that that is not the standard whenever he's writing, but he's making the case that it should be. And seemingly shortly thereafter, this sort of episcopal bishop rule starts to take prominence even by the mid-2nd century. And so depending on when Ignatius is writing, seems to have been one of the real pivot points of moving in this direction of being led by bishops rather than by elders or presbyters. One of the other interesting pieces, and man, I know we're getting close on time here. I have so many slides to go, but that's all right. Timothy and Titus, or I guess I should say 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, you'll recognize are letters that appear within the biblical text. Although they are reported to be written by Paul, the content of them has long made scholars believe that they are writings from the 2nd century, possibly even roughly contemporary with Ignatius. One of the other things that kind of undergirds that is that on early collections of Paul's writings, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus consistently do not appear among those writings within early church collections of Paul's letters. And so it's believed that they may have been written later on. Other things that kind of pop out are that there's a lot of writing against Gnosticism, which is a sort of wisdom cult that was really prominent in the 2nd century and beyond. They also write a great deal about what women's role should be in the church. And while that often is attributed to Paul as writing against women, if you read Paul in general, Paul doesn't seem to, I mean, he was the one who said there's a male or female, Jew or Greek, all are one in Christ Jesus. Paul doesn't seem to have been terribly against women's leadership within the early church. That seems to have been a development within the 2nd century. And Timothy and Titus are also very interested in how the church is structured in this bishop episcopal question that is going on, laying out very clear roles for how bishops and deacons would function. So probably by early, even to mid 2nd century, this episcopal structure really seems to be in place in the wider church. And again, these bishops would lead a group of house churches within a region. So there would be a bishop of Rome, a bishop of Antioch, a bishop of Corinth. This would sort of become the norm for Christianity. So you have this growing understanding of church leadership and how what it was that kind of helped connect all of these varying communities to one another. But it wasn't until a man named Marcion of Sinope came along that we really got our first test of not only just church structure and governance and authority, but really what it meant to be Christian. How far could you push a faith in Jesus Christ before you just, the disassociation with other Christian tradition before you just gone too far. So I'll get into Marcion. I do want to stop if there are any final questions before I make this final push over the next 10 minutes. All right, hearing none, here we go. Marcion. Marcion's a fascinating, fascinating case. So around the year 144, Marcion decides, or I guess I should set it into context first. The Jerusalem Council that we had spoke of last week essentially affirmed that Christian converts didn't need to follow Jewish practices in order to be Christian, things like circumcision, etc. That one could be Christian without following those things. Marcion essentially turns that view up to 11 and insists that Judaism is to be completely rejected, going so far as to say the God of the Old Testament was actually different than the God of the New Testament and the God that Jesus was speaking of. That they were completely different, completely different gods. As far as we can tell, and again, none of Marcion's writings survive, but numerous writings against his writings survive. And so we can kind of make out what he was arguing based on their arguments against his arguments. He seems to have believed that there was sort of this, the Yahweh of the Old Testament was a vengeful and angry God versus the God of compassion and grace. But this was sort of the divide in his world. One of the other reasons he's incredibly important is that as far as we know, Marcion is the first one to list out an acceptable canon, meaning books that are authoritative from the New Testament versus ones that he saw as not. And so the canon that he creates is a shorter and edited version of the Gospel of Luke that doesn't have a nativity story. Parables like the Good Samaritan and others are not in it, and some otherwise just broader edits to help fit his theology, as well as 10 of Paul's epistles, most of which were edited as well. That's it. From Marcion's perspective, this was the canon, was a edited version of the Gospel of Luke and 10 of Paul's epistles, full stop. That's no Gospel of Mark, no Matthew, no John, none of the other early church writings. And what the church in Rome was essentially faced with as he began to preach this and attract followers was, to what degree is he espousing Christianity, and to what degree has he just pushed it way too far? And the obvious response is that he did push it way too far. And we have what is believed to be the sort of first formal excommunication, meaning that the bishop of Rome and the overall governing structure essentially rejects and excommunicates Marcion from the church in Rome for his views. Tertullian, who is a 3rd century historian, writes a lot about Marcion. We know that Marcion and Marcionism actually continues to be an issue for the church into the 3rd century, interestingly enough. But you have this sort of definitive, this is what we're not. And it really started to force questions of, okay, so what is acceptable? What is the New Testament canon within the early church? And so you start to see this slow development. The Muratorian fragment is an incredibly important archaeological discovery. Even though it is in bad shape, it is believed to be after Marcion, the earliest known version of the New Testament canon that we have. And records almost, I think it's close to 90% of what is in our current New Testament is found within this Muratorian fragment listed out as acceptable books, including a couple of additions like the Epistle to the Laodiceans, or however you pronounce that. I wish I knew how to pronounce that. But so this fragment is incredibly important. You have another church father, Irenaeus, state definitively that there are 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and that if anyone says there are more or less, they're wrong, period. And it is one of the most kind of definitive versions we have of that. That's not to say that this was the first time that anyone had ever used 4 gospels. Like I just said, in the Muratorian fragment, it's clear that there are 4. But Irenaeus is basically making it clear, this is it. there are no other gospels that are allowed. And if you have ever looked into things like the Gnostic gospels or others, there were other purported gospels about Jesus's early life that were floating out there at that time. And Irenaeus is sort of drawing a line in the sand right around then. You have these other writings that interestingly seem to appear on different regions. They appear on authoritative lists, but ultimately don't find their way into our New Testament canon. There's a letter of Barnabas, the Didache that I mentioned. The Shepherd of Hermas was a really, I think it was the last book to be rejected. It was closely related to Revelation. And First Clement was another very popular letter that appears even into the 4th century on many lists of authoritative books. Eventually we get to Eusebius, if you remember that name. He was the historian from last session. Eusebius, at this time when Constantine is really trying to get a definitive sense of what Christianity is, Eusebius goes ahead and lists out all of these different writings and kind of categorically goes through and says what is accepted as canon, what is in dispute, and those disputes are actually interesting, and then what is just flat out rejected. Among the disputed writings, curiously enough, he listed what we know as the book of Revelation, or the Revelation of John. Eusebius lists Revelation as being disputed, noting that while many value it, in his words, he will hold his opinion until it's proper to share. So seemingly Eusebius wasn't a fan of it, but we unfortunately don't know too much more than that. But Eusebius really kind of represents this final definitive push to get what is the accepted canon of writings. And so by the mid 4th century then, this is the New Testament as we know it today, from the Gospels, the Pauline epistles, as well as the Pauline epistles that are in dispute about whether or not Paul wrote them, as well as these other early church writings, and that becomes fixed as the biblical canon and the canon of the New Testament. All right, I see a chat pop up. Are these people bishops or scholars? You mean Eusebius? Eusebius would have been in the scholar camp, and he would have been, to be fair, I don't know a ton about him other than he was kind of a Constantinian flunky, so to speak, that he was writing much more on behalf of Constantine than he was the church. He was kind of the great compiler of Christianity for Constantine. I'm fairly confident he wasn't a bishop, but I've been wrong before. So I can do a little looking on that. And the good news is we're going to hear about him next week too, so I can correct the record if I'm mistaken. Anyways, so that is essentially how we get this sort of development from these Gospels and epistles and all these letters being written into various locations. The process in which it becomes seen as the defined definitive canon. Now, occasionally you get like you take the Da Vinci Code that was 15 years ago at this point, but they really try to make a big deal about how this canon didn't exist until the 4th century. That's not to say that they make it sound like they just kind of hastily threw this list together. As we see, this list was in development for centuries, and there was fairly widespread coherence around the Gospels, Paul's writings, not long after the fact. What was really in dispute were some of the things like Revelation, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude. Some of these at the very, very tail end of the New Testament were the ones that really kind of drop on and off lists. The sort of core of the Gospels and Paul's letters really don't change that much from list to list as you go through the centuries. So I know we covered a ton today. This is my last little slide, and then I'll open us back up for questions. There we go. So the final thing as we sort of head into our last class next week and kind of our push to get to Constantine is that not only do you start to see bishops of regions sort of taking on prominence, there gradually starts to be this shift to seeing what is known as apostolic sees. It's not a great term, but essentially what it means is places that the apostles founded a church. So Corinth, Philippi, Ephesus, Rome, these sort of big important cities, that these began to take on prominence and louder voice across Christianity than bishops that would be in other cities. And these sort of apostolic sees came to be the really prominent voices within Christianity. When you think about the early church fathers, a lot of them were bishops within these regions. And you began to see this sort of gradual coalescing of, I don't want to say power, but I guess I could say power. You see them begin to take on an increasing amount of authority, culminating eventually in the Bishop of Rome coming to be seen as what we now know as the Pope and the sort of head of this episcopal structure. Catholic historians will argue that this took place earlier, but many scholars really push against the Pope being what we know as the Pope until the time either shortly before or shortly after Constantine. That's really when we see this sort of episcopal from the Pope on down to archbishops, bishops, that structure that we know today doesn't really begin to be laid out for at least a handful of centuries after the fact. So that takes us into what is going to be the close of our class, looking at some of the movement of the earliest church, or not the earliest, this sort of next generations of church fathers and leaders, a series of really devastating but ultimately helpful persecutions of Christians that helped the early church expand even as they were being attacked. And that takes place really in earnest towards the end of the 3rd century. And finally, we'll talk about Constantine, his conversion, the Edict of Milan, all these things that really flipped the church from being a persecuted minority to the official religion of the Roman Empire. It truly is an astonishing flip, and we'll do our best to kind of chart how that happened and why it might have happened. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll look at any questions, and then we can go ahead and close on out. All right, Kathy, can you send out this presentation? Yes, I owe Michael a PowerPoint. I'll owe him 2 PowerPoints now, so I'll send that on over to him. Any other questions?
My understanding is that how many councils were there in this 150-year period? Were they sort of, or was the Council of Nicaea like the first?
So the Jerusalem Council is often looked at as sort of that first in 49. It's kind of unclear, honestly, if there were, before this really strongly established episcopal structure, what degree the bishops of these different areas related to one another, or if they essentially just functioned as kind of these individual cities.
And with that, whether they had to be really cohesive and really clear in all the messaging.
Yeah, it would be fascinating to know. I mean, I think the fact that different regions had different accepted books or like different letters that they would hold, like that at least speaks to some level at which they were operating independently. But surely there must have been, they can't have operated in complete isolation. That just doesn't make any sense. And so it's kind of unclear what their relationship was. But I would love, I will promise to dig into that a little more and include that as we get into the development over next week. Have some music to play here. Nice.
Is that your walk-off music?
Yeah, I don't know, maybe. Is it like the Oscars where they start playing music and you're on stage? I don't know.
Could be.
Maybe. Well, in any case. So if no one else has any other questions, then I look forward to going through this final class with you all next week. And thanks for hopping aboard the journey and churning through a lot of history. I hope you find it as interesting as I do. I really have always found this time period to be a fascinating one. So
yeah, it's great. I love it.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Thanks, Matt.
All right.
Hey, Matt, see you next week.
All right. Bye all.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.